They came on a Tuesday. Not that the day of the week meant anything to them. The Vorath did not observe Tuesdays. They did not observe Earth calendars, Earth seasons, Earth anything. They had been watching the third planet from that small yellow star for 11 of their own cycles, which worked out to about 14 Earth years. And in all that time, they had reached a conclusion that felt to them like solid science. The humans were not ready. They were loud. They were divided. They had over 190 separate governments that disagreed on almost everything, including whether disagreement itself was healthy. They had weapons pointed at each other, debts owed to each other, old hatreds wrapped around old borders like wire around a wound. They had spent the last 3 of their own centuries finding new ways to threaten each other without quite finishing the job. The Vorath saw all of this. They cataloged it. They ran projections. They built threat models. And then their high command reviewed those models, consulted their finest military strategists, and reached a unanimous decision. Easy. The fleet that dropped out of FTL above Earth's moon was not the Vorath's largest. It was not their most advanced. It was 14 warships, which, by Vorath military doctrine, was roughly the equivalent of sending a very firm letter with the option of follow-up. High Executor Vron had argued for more. The High Council had overruled him. 14 ships, they said, was a message. 14 ships said, we are not even trying yet. 14 ships said, look at what we can do without effort, and imagine what comes next if you make us bother. It was meant to be elegant. The message they broadcast was translated into 47 Earth languages simultaneously. The Vorath had been thorough about that, at least. Every major government received it at exactly the same moment, at 3:47 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, on a Tuesday in early October. You have 72 hours to begin formal surrender proceedings. Resistance is unnecessary. Your world will be administered fairly. Comply and nothing further will be required of you. Then they waited. In a basement room in Geneva, 6 floors beneath the main UN building, Ambassador Keth Voss heard the message on a small speaker mounted near the ceiling of his holding cell. He had been in that cell for 4 months. He had told them the Vorath were coming. He had told them the timeline. He had brought documentation, navigational charts, fleet compositions, 17 recorded testimonies from other species, who had received the same broadcast with 47 hours on the clock instead of 72. They had thanked him. They had debated whether he was genuine. They had debated whether it mattered. They had locked him in a clean, comfortable room and continued debating. Now the message played through the small speaker, and Keth sat on his cot and listened to it in the original Vorath, which he understood perfectly, and then listened to it again in English, and then in French, and then the speaker went quiet. He waited. 20 minutes later, a guard slid a tray of food under the door. Keth did not move toward it. He looked at the ceiling instead, at the water stain shaped vaguely like a hand. Are they going to surrender? He asked. The guard said nothing for a moment. Then there was a sound, a short, low sound. It took Keth a moment to identify it because he had spent a lot of time among humans but had never quite learned to anticipate when the sound would come. The guard was laughing. Not cruelly, not nervously, just laughing, the way you laugh at something that is almost too obvious to be funny. Then the footsteps moved away down the corridor, and Keth was alone again. He sat very still. He was a defector. He had left the Dominion because he had read their projections and read human history and understood something the High Council's models had failed to account for. The models were very good. The models measured weapons counts, fleet tonnage, economic output, political cohesion indices. The models did not measure what happened to a species that had been fighting itself for 3,000 years, the first time it had a common enemy. Keth pulled the food tray closer. He ate, and for the first time in 4 months he was afraid, not for himself and not for Earth. For the Vorath. Hour 73 came and went without a surrender. The Vorath fleet admiral in command of the 14 ships, a rigid, precise officer named Tal who had run 46 planetary subjugations without incident, gave the order at 4:47 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. 3 of Earth's communications satellites vanished in flashes that were visible from the ground in Central Asia. The Meridian Station a joint research platform with a crew of 41 from 12 countries, was struck and broke apart over the South Pacific. 41 people died in approximately 4 seconds. Then the main strike fell on Auckland. The city had a population of 1.7 million. The weapon was a focused kinetic impactor, clean by Vorath standards, meaning it released no radiation, no persistent contamination. It was, in the language of Vorath military doctrine, a demonstration strike. The crater was 3 kilometers wide. The shockwave carried another 11 kilometers. Final death count, confirmed over the following weeks, 340,000 people. Fleet Admiral Tal filed his report. Demonstration conducted, awaiting surrender response. He waited 18 hours. No surrender came. What came instead was noise, enormous, global, chaotic noise. Every human media channel lit up simultaneously. Governments issued statements. Militaries went to maximum alert. Protests erupted. Vigils erupted. People screamed at the sky, at their screens, at each other. The Vorath monitoring team flagged this as consistent with projected collapse behavior. Tal read the flag and agreed. Panicked population. Political system fragmenting under pressure. Surrender likely within 72 additional hours. He filed the projection. He went asleep. He did not know, because the monitoring team had not flagged it as significant, about the document. It had been called over the years by many names: the Unified Emergency Framework, the Last Resort Compact, the thing nobody wants to sign. It had been drafted during the second decade of the 21st century by a small group of international law scholars who had looked at the state of the world and thought, with the specific despair of very clever people, but what if it gets worse than this? The framework was simple, brutally simple, which was the only reason it had ever survived committee review. In the event of an external existential threat to the human species, all signatory nations would immediately subordinate their individual military commands to a single unified Earth Force command structure. No debate, no vote, automatic. The signing of the document was the vote, and it would only ever need to happen once. 31 nations had signed it over the years, quietly, without fanfare, the way you buy fire insurance, hopping you never need it, not wanting to think too hard about what needing it would look like. It needed 2/3 of UN member states to activate. In the 48 hours following Auckland, the remaining nations signed it. All of them. Not because anyone forced them. Not because there was a meeting, or a negotiation, or a compromise reached. They signed it because 340,000 people were dead in New Zealand, and 41 more were dead in the South Pacific, and 14 enemy warships were sitting above their moon, and the document was already written, and they all understood, in the wordless place below argument, that this was what the document was for. The United Earth Force came into existence at 11:00 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, 49 hours after Auckland. It had no ships yet, no unified command structure yet, no doctrine, no flag, no anthem. It had signatures. The woman who would become its first fleet admiral was, at that moment, standing in a parking garage in Accra, Ghana in the rain, trying to get her car to start. Yara Osai was 53 years old. She had served in the Ghanaian Navy for 19 years before being seconded to the African Union Defense Cooperation Program, and from there, to a rotating advisory position with the UN's largely ceremonial Space Security Committee, which had spent most of its existence writing reports that nobody read. She was not famous. She was not the most decorated officer in any room she entered. What she was, what people who had served with her understood, and people who hadn't tended to find out too late, was the kind of person who thought 3 moves ahead and never, under any circumstances, panicked. She had been called in the first hour after Auckland. She had driven to a secure communication facility, received a full briefing, driven back to her apartment, packed a bag, driven back to the facility, sat through 6 hours of argument between 12 different senior officers from 8 different nations. And then, when the framework activated and the room went quiet with the weight of it, been the first person to speak. She had said, "The fleet composition at the moon is a probe. They sent 14 ships because they expected 14 to be enough. They are waiting to see if the demonstration worked. It hasn't. The question now is how long before they realize that and send the rest." Nobody had argued. That was the thing about Yara. Nobody argued. The car finally started on the 4th try. She drove through the rain toward what was now, technically, a UEF facility, and she thought about the 14 ships above the moon, and she thought about what 14 ships said about how the Vorath saw humanity, and she felt something settle in her chest like a stone going to the bottom of a lake. It was not anger exactly. Anger was loud. This was quieter than anger, more patient. The specific feeling of a person who has just been told something is impossible and who has already begun, in the back of their mind, to prove it wrong. She received her commission the following morning. The room was full of generals and admirals from 30 countries, and none of them looked like they had slept, and all of them were watching her the way people watch someone they have just agreed to follow and are still deciding whether they trust. She let them watch. She read the commission document, she set it down, she looked at the room. "We have," she said, "2 assets the Vorath have not modeled for. The first is time. They expect us to collapse in days. Every day we do not collapse is a day we use. The second is production capacity. They see our economy as a civilian economy. We are going to change what it is." She paused. Every car plant, every shipyard, every aerospace facility, every university engineering program, every heavy manufacturing operation on this planet is now a defense asset. We are not going to fight the fleet above our moon. Not yet. We are going to build until we can. Someone from the German contingent, a general with the tired eyes of a man who had done this math, said, "The timeline for fleet parity." "I know the timeline," Ose said. "We are going to beat it." She said it the way other people say *good morning. As a fact. As a thing that was already true and simply hadn't happened yet. The room was quiet. She picked up the commission document and set it in her briefcase. "Begin mobilization," she said, "all of it." Above the moon, Fleet Admiral Tall reviewed his latest monitoring reports. The human political system had not fragmented. The noise had not decreased. He flagged this as unusual and queried the projection model for updated surrender probability. The model returned 71% likelihood of formal surrender within 14 days. Tall accepted this. He was a precise man. He trusted precise numbers. He filed a routine status report to the High Executor. He noted that the humans appeared to be undergoing significant political reorganization, which the model assessed as stress behavior consistent with pre-surrender negotiation positioning. He did not flag the document. His monitoring team had noted it but assessed it as symbolic, another piece of the noise. Human governments signed symbolic documents constantly. It was one of the things that made them easy to read. Below him, in the dark, on a planet of 8 billion people who were now, for the first time in their recorded history, answering to a single command, the mobilization began. It began quietly, it always does. Factory floor managers got calls at 2 a.m. University department heads got emails marked urgent UEF directive. Port authorities received new shipping manifests. Fuel allocation systems changed. The calls and emails and manifests and allocation changes rippled outward through a civilization the size of a planet, and most of it happened in the dark, and none of it was loud, and the Voreth monitoring team did not flag any of it as significant. In his basement cell in Geneva, Keth Voss slept more soundly than he had in months. He had done the math a long time ago. He knew what was coming, not the details, not the battles, but the shape of it, the long, grinding, inevitable shape of what happened when you woke something up that had been fighting itself for 3,000 years and finally gave it somewhere else to point. He almost felt sorry for Vran. Almost. The factory had made golf equipment 6 weeks ago. General D. Jung Park stood on the mezzanine and looked down at the floor and watched the machines that had once pressed titanium clubheads now pressing something else entirely. Long, clean cylinders of hardened alloy, each one inspected by hand before moving down the line. The floor smelled of oil and metal, and the particular sharpness of people who had not gone home in a long time. The shift running below him had started at 4 a.m. It would end at 4 p.m. The next shift was already in the break room eating. The facility was in Incheon, South Korea. It had employed 400 people before the UEF directive came through. It now employed 1,100. The additional 700 had signed their employment contracts, received 4 days of basic orientation, and been put on the line. There was not time for more than 4 days. The line supervisor, a small, sharp-faced woman named Jaeyeon who had been with the original company for 12 years, had adapted the training program herself because no one from UEF Command had sent her one. She had looked at what the machines needed to do, looked at what her people could learn in 4 days, and built the bridge. Park had read about her in a logistics report. That was how he had ended up here, reading logistics reports the way other people read morning news, because right now the logistics reports were where the real story was. He went down the stairs to the floor. Jaeyeon appeared at his elbow before he reached the bottom step. She did not look impressed by his rank. She looked like a woman who was managing 1,100 people and 17 retooled machines and 3 incoming raw material shipments, and did not have time to be impressed by rank. "General," she said. "I wanted to see the output numbers in person," he said. "They're on the report." "I know, I wanted to see them in person." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded and walked him to the end of the line where the finished rounds were being crated. She picked one up, handed it to him. He felt the weight of it more than he expected, which was always the case no matter how many times he read the specs. "We're running at 91% efficiency," she said. "We'd be at 96, but the third press is getting a harmonic vibration in the lower housing that I can't get a maintenance crew to look at because every maintenance crew in the province is running 2 other retrofits. I'll make a call." "I know you will." A pause. "My brother died at Auckland." Park said nothing. He turned the round over in his hands. "I'm not telling you that so you feel bad," she said. "I'm telling you because you should know why the night shift runs overtime without being asked. Everyone down here has a reason. The reasons are none of your business, but the extra hours are a thing you should know about." He set the round back on the tray. "I'll make the call about the maintenance crew today." She nodded. He walked the rest of the floor. Nobody stopped working when he passed. Nobody looked up for more than a second. They had rounds to make and presses to watch, and they were making and watching them. He had been a soldier for 31 years. He had seen motivated troops before. He had seen patriotic speeches and unit cohesion and the specific fire that comes into a unit after a shared loss. This was something different. This was quieter, more even. Less fire, more weight. People who had picked up something heavy and intended to carry it as far as they needed to carry it without making a production of the carrying. He left the factory and sat in the back of his transport and called about the maintenance crew. Dr. Mia Santos had not slept in a bed in 3 weeks. She slept on a cot in the corner of the room she had converted into her primary working space in the UEF's Emergency Production Directorate headquarters in Sao Paulo. The room had been a conference room. It was now covered in screens, 41 of them, all showing different things. Production throughput from the 17 active continental zones, raw material pipeline status, workforce allocation numbers, shipping manifests, energy grid draws by region. She was 38 years old and had a background in industrial logistics and systems optimization, and she had been, before all this, running the operational side of a shipping consortium that moved cargo around South America. She had been very good at that job. She had made the consortium 11% more efficient in 4 years, which in cargo logistics was an almost obscene improvement. The UEF had called her on the same day it called everyone. The directive she received said, in the specific dry language of emergency governance, "You are hereby appointed lead coordinator, emergency production directive, effective immediately. Your authority includes requisition of facilities, redirection of industrial capacity, and binding prioritization of raw material allocations across all member state territories." She had read it twice, asked one question, "Who do I report to?" Received the answer Fleet Admiral Osai directly, and then started working. That had been 41 days ago. The number she was looking at now was the one she checked first every morning because it was the number everything else was built on. Current production rate of UEF standard weapons-grade components, measured against the baseline from Day 1. Day 1, 100. Day 41, 340. 3.4 times what they'd started with. In 41 days. The target for Day 90 was 800. She looked at the curve, at the slope of it, and then she looked at the production constraints report her team had filed at midnight and found the 3 places where the curve was starting to bend the wrong way and circled them with a stylus. Energy. The grid was being pulled in 17 directions simultaneously, and 2 continental zones were showing brownout risk. Shipping bottleneck. The port in Rotterdam was running at 140% rated capacity, and the cranes were starting to fail. Skilled labor gap. Precision machining for the drive component assemblies required training that took longer than 4 days, and there was no way around it. She flagged all 3 for Osai's morning briefing. Then she started building solutions to all 3 simultaneously, because flagging a problem without a solution was a thing she had stopped doing around Day 3. The energy problem could be partially addressed by staggering shift start times across zones to flatten the peak draw. She wrote the directive. The Rotterdam bottleneck required prioritization. She pulled up the shipping manifest and started cutting lower priority loads to free crane time for the weapons components. The skilled labor gap was harder. She sat with that one for 40 minutes looking at the numbers before the answer arrived: train the trainers faster, double the instructor corps by pulling qualified machinists off production lines for 2 weeks to teach, then send them back. Short-term production loss, long-term gain. She wrote the directive. By 6 a.m., she had written 11 directives, eaten a container of cold rice someone had left outside her door, and updated her throughput projection for Day 90. She crossed out 800. She wrote 940. Fleet Admiral Osai reviewed the morning briefings at 5:45 a.m. in a UEF facility outside London that had been a naval intelligence center and was now the closest thing humanity had to a war room. She went through them in order: production, fleet status, intelligence, Vorath monitoring. The production report made her pause for a moment. She made a small mark next to Santos's new Day 90 projection. Then she moved on. The fleet status report was harder to read. They had 23 warships, retrofitted cargo ships and decommissioned national naval vessels, mostly. The UEF didn't have the luxury of building from scratch yet, not for the first wave. 23 ships crewed by people who had been doing this, on average, for about 6 weeks, against 14 Vorath warships that had been purpose-built for exactly this kind of work by a civilization that had been doing planetary subjugation for 200 years. The numbers were not good. The numbers were never going to be good at the start. That was the point of having a start. The intelligence report said the Vorath had been in contact with their home system. The monitoring team had intercepted communications they couldn't fully decode, but had decoded enough to know. Fleet Admiral Tal had filed updates. The updates described the human situation as volatile but proceeding to collapse. Tal expected surrender within the week. Osai set down the report and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she picked up the fleet status report again and started writing deployment orders. The Battle of Luna Perimeter happened on a Thursday, 17 days after Auckland. Later, people who wrote about the war would struggle with how to categorize it. It was not a victory. 40% of the human fleet was destroyed or disabled in the first 90 minutes. The Vorath lost 2 ships, 1 destroyed, 1 critically damaged. By any metric of tonnage and firepower, the Vorath won. Tal filed his battle report with that assessment. Engagement decisive. Human fleet capability negligible. Recommend continued psychological pressure through orbital demonstration. What the report did not contain, because Tal did not know how to file it, because his reporting system had no category for it, was the behavioral data. The human ships had not broken formation when the first volleys hit them. They had not retreated. Several had executed attack runs on the damaged Vorath ship, with what the Vorath tactical AI classified as *irrational persistence, given the loss rates being sustained. One human commander, a Brazilian naval captain named Rodrigo Armada, who would not survive the battle, had rammed his ship into the side of a Vorath cruiser at full acceleration after his weapons systems failed. The Vorath tactical AI flagged all of this under a category called *anomalous behavior. Tal read the flag. He assumed it meant the human commanders had been poorly trained, that the irrational persistence was inexperience rather than choice. He sent a message back to High Executor Vron that said, "First engagement complete. Human fleet destroyed at acceptable cost. Recommend increase in psychological pressure to accelerate collapse." Vron approved the recommendation. On Earth, the human dead from Luna Perimeter were listed. The names took up 3 full pages of the briefing document Os received the following morning. She read every name. Her face did not change. She set the document down and picked up the production report. Day 34, throughput at 390. She crossed out the number Mia Santos had written on Day 90's projection. She wrote a new one. Keth Voss received a visitor on Day 40. They let him out of the cell for the first time, took him up 6 floors and through 2 security checkpoints and into a room with a window. The window looked out at the lake. The lake was gray and still. There was a mountain behind it with cloud on top of the mountain. The visitor was a young man from UEF Intelligence who introduced himself as Henrik and sat across from Keth with a notepad and a recording device, and the specific careful posture of someone who had been told to take this seriously. "We want to talk about production timelines," Henrik said. "Specifically, the Vorath's production capacity versus their deployment reserves. We think." "You want to know when they stop sending probes and send everything," Keth said. Henrik paused. "Yes." 90 days, Keth said. "Maybe 100. Vron is patient, but he has a council to answer to, and the council set a campaign timeline and he won't want to miss it. If the surrender doesn't come in 90 days, he'll move to full invasion. Ground forces. The idea is to land on the planet and make the cost personal, physical, so the population breaks from the inside." Henrik was writing, "And if they do that?" Keth looked at the lake. He had been thinking about this for 40 days in a basement. He had been thinking about it, if he was honest, for years before he ever came to Earth. "Then they find out," he said, "that what they saw in orbit was the soft part." On Day 57, Dr. Santos updated her projection again. Day 90 throughput estimate, 1,100. She stared at the number for a long time. It didn't feel real. Numbers that Big never felt real until they were behind you and you could look back at them. She sent the update to Admiral Osai. Osai read it at 5:47 a.m. She made a mark next to it. Then she opened the fleet status report, which now listed 41 ships, and started planning for the fleet they would have in 30 more days, and the fleet after that, and the one after that, because the thing about the curve Mia Santos was riding was that it didn't flatten on its own. It kept going, as long as you fed it. High Executive Vron received a report on day 60 that he read 3 times. The report was from his intelligence team. It contained analysis of intercepted UEF communications, partial, fragmentary, but enough to run projections. The communications concerned production rates, industrial output, fleet assembly timelines. His intelligence chief, a meticulous officer named Save, had included a projection at the end of the report. The projection showed 2 lines on a graph. One line was the Voreth fleet capacity currently deployed in the Earth system. The other line was the projected UEF fleet capacity at 30-day intervals. The lines crossed at approximately day 180. "This is their production acceleration?" Vron asked. "Yes, High Executor. This is verified. As much as we can verify, there is significant noise in the intercepts, but the directional trend is." "How long have they been running at this rate?" Save checked his notes. "From what we can determine, approximately from the first week. The acceleration began almost immediately after the framework activation." Vron looked at the graph for a long time. He had run 43 campaigns. He had subjugated 11 species. He had never seen a production acceleration curve like this one. He had never seen a species take an existential blow and respond not with panic and fragmentation but with this, whatever this was. He looked at the crossing point on the graph, day 180. "We moved to full invasion at day 90, he said. Save blinked. "High Executor, the full invasion option was assessed as." "At day 90, Vron said, "ground forces. I want them on the surface. I want the population to feel the war directly." He closed the report. "They will break," he said. "They always break when it becomes real." He believed this. He had no reason not to believe it. It had been true 11 times. It would not be true on the 12th. But he did not know that yet, sitting in his command suite with the graph in front of him, looking at 2 lines that were moving toward each other with the slow inevitability of something that had already been decided. Below him, across the void, on a planet that had been building without stopping for 60 days, the machines kept running. They did not know they were supposed to stop. Nobody had told them to. The Voreth came down in the dark. 2 drops simultaneous 93 days after Auckland. The first in Central Asia, a broad flat reach of steppe in Kazakhstan, chosen because it was open and defensible and far from dense civilian population, which the Voreth War doctrine designated as a preferred landing zone. The second in North Africa, the eastern edge of the Sahara, same reasoning. Open, clear, good for armor, good for establishing a beachhead. General De Jong Park had been watching the drop projections for 3 weeks. He had read every piece of Voreth military intelligence Keth Voss had given them, and then he had read it again, and then he had given it to 8 of his best senior officers and told them to find what was wrong with it. What was wrong with it was nothing, as military doctrine went. The Voreth doctrine was clean and logical and had worked 11 times on 11 different species. What was wrong with it, in a way that the doctrine didn't account for, was that it had never been run on a species that had spent 3,000 years fighting on its own surface. Park had the North Africa theater. He got it because he'd asked for it, specifically, because the Sahara terrain suited what he had in mind, and what he had in mind was not what the Voreth were expecting. What the Voreth were expecting was a fixed defensive line. That's what every other species had done. Build a line, hold it, get flanked, collapse. Park gave them the cities instead. The first city to go was a regional hub in southern Egypt, a place called Karga, population 70,000, which had been evacuated 3 days before the Voreth ground forces reached it. The Voreth entered it methodically, building by building, expecting ambush. They found empty streets, empty buildings. Some of them still had food on the tables. Their field commander, a ground marshal named Drath, flagged this as unusual. He ordered a full sweep before advancing. The sweep took 11 hours. Park's forces were 40 kilometers east, building something. When Drath finished the sweep and advanced, he found Karga behind him, and 15 kilometers of supply line running through open desert, and a 2-kilometer stretch of road that had been mined with equipment that had been manufactured in an Indian auto plant 8 weeks ago, and shipped across 2 countries in what the Voreth monitoring team had classified as civilian freight. The first Voreth supply column hit the mines at 3 a.m. local time. Park was awake. He had been awake for 31 hours. He received the contact report in a forward command post that was 3 shipping containers bolted together and partially buried in a hillside, and he looked at the map and said to his chief of staff, Colonel Ana Lima, "They'll adjust their supply routing. They'll go around the eastern approach." "We mind the eastern approach," Lima said. "I know, they'll find those too. That's not the point." He pointed at the map. "The point is every hour they spend not moving is an hour Santos's people spend building. We don't have to win, we have to take time." Lima looked at the map. "That's very bleak." "It's extremely bleak," Park agreed. "Get some sleep." He said this to her knowing she would not sleep, because he was not going to sleep, and everyone in the 3-container command post knew it, and they all stayed awake together and watched the Voreth adjust their supply routing toward the eastern approach. The fighting that followed did not look like what most people imagined when they imagined war. It looked like a city block taken and retaken 4 times in 6 days. It looked like a crossroads held by 12 people for 9 hours against a Voreth armored advance, because the crossroads led to a water treatment facility that the evacuation plan needed 3 more days to complete. It looked like a technical mounted on a pickup truck racing through an alley. It looked like drone footage of positions that no longer existed. It looked like the specific silence of a building after everyone inside it was gone. Park moved his forward command post 11 times in 20 days. He gave up ground strategically and held it irrationally, and the Voreth tactical AI kept mispredicting where he would stop because the AI modeled for either retreat or resistance, and Park was doing both simultaneously in a pattern that made no sense unless you understood that the pattern's purpose was not tactical. It was temporal. He was buying time. Every day was a day. Every day was more ships, more rounds, more everything. He had conversations with Osai twice a day, encrypted, brief. She told him the numbers. He listened to the numbers. He went back to his map. The prisoner arrived at his current command, post on day 27 of the ground campaign. The Voreth field commander had been taken in an ambush near what had been a small town called Moot. His escort had been destroyed by a combination of mines and an anti-tank team that had set up in a dried riverbed 3 days earlier and waited. The Voreth commander himself had survived because the soldiers who reached him first had been specifically ordered to take him alive, which they had done despite the fact that he was large and resisted, and one of them had a broken arm by the end of it. His name, as best as the translation software could render it, was Grev Tan. He was a mid-level ground commander, equivalent roughly to a colonel. He sat in a chair in the back of Park's command post and looked around with the specific flat expression of someone who was taking in information and not yet deciding what to do with it. Park sat across from him, with the translator running on a tablet between them. "Water," Park offered. Grev Tan looked at the cup. After a moment he took it. Park waited while the translation software calibrated to Grev Tan's speech patterns. It took about 4 minutes. Grevton sat and drank water and looked at the maps on the walls. Park watched him look at the maps and did not cover them, because there was nothing on those maps that would help Grevton, and because he wanted to see what the Voreth commander's eyes went to first. His eyes went to the supply lines. That told Park something. He filed it. "You've been losing a lot of supply columns," Park said, once the software was ready. Grevton didn't answer. "That's fine. I'm not asking you to tell me anything. I'm making an observation." Park poured himself water from the same container. "You're going to adjust your routing. You probably already have. On the other columns, you'll armor your escorts more heavily. That'll slow you down, but it'll protect the supplies." Grevton watched him. "What I'm curious about," Park said, "is what your people think is going to happen when the supplies get through, when you push us back from another town. What do you think comes next?" Silence. Then Grevton spoke. The software took a moment. "Your population breaks," it rendered. "The cost becomes too high. Your kind cannot sustain this." Park nodded. "What would it take for your kind to stop fighting?" Grevton answered without hesitation. The software rendered, "If we were losing." Park set down his water cup. He looked at Grevton for a moment. "Then you understand," he said. Grevton looked at him. Something moved behind the alien's eyes, not quite confusion, but the expression of someone revising a category they thought was settled. Park stood up. "Keep him comfortable," he said to Lima, who had appeared at the entrance. "Make sure he can see outside if he wants to." Lima raised an eyebrow. "I want him to be able to watch the supply convoys we're running in," Park said. "From the east, the ones that have been coming in every 18 hours since the campaign started." Lima looked at him. "The supply convoys full of munitions from the plants," he said. "The plants that have been running continuously since day 3. He went back to his map. Keth Voss had been moved, on day 60 of the war, from his basement cell in Geneva to a room with a window that was on the 4th floor of a UEF intelligence facility outside London. He was not a prisoner anymore, exactly. He was a consultant. He had signed something that gave him that status, and in exchange, he attended briefings and answered questions and tried to be useful. He attended the daily intelligence briefing on day 102. It covered both theaters. He sat at the end of the long table and watched the screens and listened to the analysts and said nothing. After the briefing, the intelligence director, a quiet Finnish man named Vertinen, asked if he had anything to add. Keth thought about it. "You should know," he said, "that what your soldiers are doing in the ground campaigns, the dark humor, the jokes." He paused. "We intercepted some of your radio communications early in the campaign, internal channels between your soldiers." Vertinen waited. "The Voreth Tactical Analysis Team flagged it as data corruption," Keth said. "They could not model a scenario in which combatants under those conditions were exchanging humor. It did not fit any behavioral category in their system. They assumed the communications were not authentic." The room was quiet. "I'm telling you this," Keth said, "because their models are still running on that assumption. They are fighting a version of you that does not laugh." He looked at the table. "They are not fighting you." Vertinen wrote something on his notepad. The briefing ended. People stood up and left. Keth stayed seated and looked at the screen, which was still showing the ground campaign map. He looked at the push and pull of it, the messy tidal shape of 100 small fights happening simultaneously across 2 continents, and he thought about what the Dominion's models said this looked like: a civilization in terminal collapse, bleeding out, about to break. And he thought about what it actually was. He had lived among humans long enough to know the difference between a civilization falling apart and a civilization in the specific, focused, cold-burning state of something that has decided. They had decided. He wasn't sure the Voreth had a word for it. He wasn't sure the Voreth had ever needed one. High Executor Vron received the ground campaign reports on day 105. He read them in his command suite with Save standing at a respectful distance, which was where Save stood when the news was not good. "Progress is slower than projected," Vron said. "Yes, High Executor." "The supply losses." "Significant. Ground Marshal Drath has adjusted routing 7 times. Each adjustment adds transit time." Vron looked at the map. The Voreth ground forces had taken and held a substantial area in both theaters. On a map it looked like progress. In terms of what it had cost, it looked like something else. "The production reports." Save was quiet for a moment. That specific quiet that preceded numbers Vron was not going to enjoy. "Current UEF fleet is at 61 vessels." Vron looked at him. "Up from 41 at last count," Save said. 19 days ago." 20 vessels in 19 days. Vron ran the math without wanting to. He ran it anyway because he was the kind of commander who ran math he didn't want to run, because the alternative was worse. "And the production rate projection?" "Accelerating," Save said. "Still accelerating." Vron looked at the ground campaign map. He looked at the territory held. He looked at the lines of engagement, which were not neat lines. They were ragged. They were porous. They moved and shifted and failed to resolve the way every other campaign's lines had resolved. He thought about the species he was fighting. He had read the histories. He had read about the wars they had fought with each other, the scale of them, the duration, the catastrophic cost they had repeatedly been willing to absorb in pursuit of victory. He had read about it and classified it as a form of internal instability, a species that could not stop fighting itself, which was a form of weakness. He was beginning to revise that classification. A species that could not stop fighting itself was not weak. It was practiced. He filed his updated recommendation to the High Council. He used careful language. He said the campaign was proceeding within acceptable parameters with some adjustment of timeline projections. He said he was revising certain tactical approaches based on new intelligence. He said he remained confident in the campaign's ultimate success. He did not say, "I am starting to worry about the curve on that production graph." He did not say, "Their ground forces fight the way water gets into stone, not hard enough to crack it all at once, just patient enough to find every gap." He did not say, "I ran the math tonight and I did not like what I found." He sent the report. He went to his bunk. He lay in the dark for a long time. On the planet below him, in 3 shipping containers bolted together in a hillside, General Park was still awake, looking at a map. He had moved his forward command post again. Number 15. He had started to lose count, but Lima kept a tally on the wall, hash marks in black marker, so he always knew. He looked at the hash marks. He looked at the map. He looked at the supply convoy manifests that had come in that evening, what was arriving, what was going out, what was staying. The numbers were better than they'd been last week. The numbers were going to be better next week than they were now. He knew this the way he knew the sun came up. Not because he felt hopeful, but because the curve was what it was, and curves didn't lie if you read them right. He was buying time. The machine was spending it. He went asleep for 4 hours, because 4 was what he had, and then he got up and looked at the map again. Outside, the desert was cold and dark and quiet in the specific way that battlefields are quiet between the noise, not peaceful, just paused, like something holding its breath before the next thing happens. The next thing was already on its way. Park could see it on the map. He poured coffee, he waited. The ship had no name when it was launched. It received one 3 weeks later, during a commissioning ceremony that lasted 11 minutes because 11 minutes was all the schedule allowed. It was called the Meridian Asterisk, after the station, after the 41 people, after the thing you name something when you want to remember why you built it. The captain received the commission document, shook the hands that needed shaking, and had the ship underway before the bunting was taken down. That was how it went that year, 11 minutes was 11 minutes. The Meridian was the 93rd ship commissioned into the UEF fleet. It was also, for the first time, not a retrofitted cargo hauler or a reconfigured national naval vessel. It had been built from scratch, in a facility in Gdansk that had been converted in 42 days, which remained a source of fierce industrial pride in the city and a footnote in 3 separate engineering journals, from a commercial shipyard that had previously made container ships. It weighed more than anything the yard had ever made before. It was faster than that weight had any business being. It had weapons systems that had not existed as engineering concepts 18 months ago, built on a framework that Dr. Santos's production directorate had developed specifically, because the conventional frameworks took too long to manufacture. It was, in a word that the Vorath didn't have and wouldn't have understood, lean. Everything on it that didn't need to be there wasn't. Everything that did was the best version of itself that could be built in the time available. Admiral Os inspected it on the day it joined the fleet. She walked the corridors and the engine room and the bridge and asked questions, and the crew answered them, and she nodded at each answer with the economy of someone who is checking things off a list she has carried in her head for a very long time. At the end of the inspection, she stood on the bridge and looked at the tactical display. The fleet was 114 ships now. More were being commissioned every week. She looked at the display for a moment. Then she looked at the tactical chart of Vorath space, the portion of it they'd been able to map from Keth Voss's information and from the intelligence gathered during Luna Perimeter. "The Vorath reach," she said to her chief of staff, a woman named Commander Fadu Diallo who had been with her since Geneva, and had the tired, precise manner of someone who had stopped being surprised by the scale of things. 18 light towers out, Diallo said. Main staging area for their operations in this region. 3 fleet stations by current intelligence. Defense screen is. "I know what the defense screen is," Osai said. "I've read the estimates." "Yes, ma'am. What I want to know is whether the estimates account for what we now know about their redeployment from the ground campaign." Diallo paused. "Not fully. The ground campaign has pulled approximately 14% of their near-Earth defense assets back toward the Reach for resupply rotations," Osai said, "which means the Reach itself is running slightly below optimal defensive coverage at any given time while the rotation is in transit." She looked at the display. "I want updated targeting matrices by Thursday." Diallo wrote it down. "You're planning to go out." "We were always going to go out," Osai said. "That was never a question. The question was when." She looked at the display again, at the 114 ships, at the curve that said next month would be 140, the month after that 170. "It's when." The message from the Vorath came on a Wednesday morning. It arrived through a frequency that Keth Voss had identified as the standard Vorath diplomatic channel, different from their military frequencies, cleaner, no encryption. The translation team had it rendered in 40 minutes and in front of Os in 41. It was a ceasefire proposal. The language was careful and formal and dense, with the specific qualifications that the Vorath apparently used when they were trying to sound like they were offering more than they were. The operational summary, stripped of the qualifications, was: stop fighting, negotiate a boundary, both sides withdraw to existing positions. Osai read it twice. She wrote a forwarding note for UEF Council review. She added a single attached note of her own, "Not yet." She sent it and went back to the targeting matrices. Keth Voss read the ceasefire proposal when it was shared with him for analysis. He sat with it for a long time. Then he wrote a 3-paragraph response for the intelligence briefing and sent it to Vertinen. The response said, in summary, "This is not a diplomatic document. This is a reconnaissance document. They want to know if you'll stop. The answer to that question tells them something about where you think you are in the war and where you think you can go." He added, in the final paragraph, something he had been thinking about for several weeks. The Dominion has never faced a species that went on offense. Their entire doctrinal framework assumes that a defending species either surrenders or holds ground. They have no strategic model for an enemy that absorbs the opening blows and then moves toward you. I would strongly recommend that the Council consider what the psychological impact of that will be, not just tactically, but on the Dominion's broader network of client species and observers. Vertinen read it. He shared it with the Council. The Council discussed it for a long time. I received a summary of the discussion while she was reviewing fleet deployment orders. She read the summary. She made one note in the margin: agree, execute accordingly. She went back to the deployment orders. The fleet that assembled in lunar orbit on day 161 was 127 ships. Not all of them were the *Meridian *S generation. About a third were the original retrofits, the rough and heavy vessels from the early days, kept in service because they were crewed by people who had been doing this for nearly 5 months, and that experience was not replaceable. The new ships were faster and better armed. The old ships had something the new ones didn't yet, the kind of institutional knowledge that lives in the hands of crews who have been through contact. OSI flew her flag from the OSI, a name given to the fleet's command vessel without ceremony or consultation, simply appearing on the manifest one day, and she had not changed it, not because she was sentimental but because she had learned to spend her objections on things that mattered. She called the fleet commanders together on the day before departure. Not all of them in person. 17 were remote, holographic images projected around the table. She looked at all of them, present and projected, and said what needed saying. "This is not a raid," she said. "This is not a show of force. We are going to the Vorath Reach, and we are going to destroy their capacity to continue offensive operations in this sector. We are doing this because the fastest way to end this war is to make continuing it more expensive for them than stopping it. We are not going to give them a ceasefire line to hide behind. We are going to make the choice obvious." She paused. "You were trained in different doctrines. Some of you were trained by navies that hadn't spoken to each other in 50 years. You are going to fight next to those navies now, and you are going to trust them and they are going to trust you, because we cannot afford anything less than that, and everyone in this room knows it." She looked around the table. Questions. There were questions. She answered them. The meeting lasted 48 minutes. The Battle of Vorath Reach began at 400 hours local fleet time. It lasted 9 days. Vron commanded the defense personally. He was not, by any measure, an ordinary commander. He was the product of the Dominion's finest military institutions, decorated across 4 campaigns, possessed of the kind of tactical mind that can hold a dozen simultaneous engagements in careful analytical order. He was, for the first 4 days, doing what he had always done, managing the engagement, predicting human movements, redirecting his forces to intercept. He was predicting them correctly about 60% of the time. He had never, in 43 campaigns, predicted an enemy at 60%. He had never run below 85. The gap between what he expected and what happened, that 40%, was not random. It was patterned. He was certain of it, but the pattern changed every 18 to 24 hours, which meant the human commanders were running rotating doctrines, cycling between tactical frameworks, which meant they had enough different trained approaches to do that, which meant. He made himself stop. He focused on the engagement. The problem, the fundamental problem, the one he kept coming back to in the 6-hour windows between engagement cycles when he allowed himself to think about it, was that the humans didn't fight like they should fight. They had ships that were smaller and in many individual cases less capable than his. They had crews that were newer. They were operating far from home in unfamiliar space. They fought like they had nothing to lose. Which was, he finally understood, exactly the problem. Species with something to lose fought carefully. They weighed odds. They retreated when the math said retreat. They sought favorable positions. The humans had already lost Auckland. They had already lost Luna Perimeter. They had already lost 3 months of ground campaign at significant cost. They had done the math on losing and apparently found it insufficient reason to stop, which meant the math didn't work the way it worked on every other species. On day 5, one of the 3 Vorath fleet stations at the Reach was destroyed. On day 7, the second was crippled beyond immediate combat use. Vron ordered a fighting withdrawal. He did it cleanly, professionally, the way a good commander manages a bad situation. He preserved 60% of his fleet. He fell back to the next defensive line. He filed his report with the High Council. The report said, in the formal language of Dominion military communication, that the engagement at the Reach had resulted in a tactical setback requiring strategic reassessment. What it meant was they came into our space, they destroyed 2 of our stations, we fell back. The High Council read the report. They discussed it for 6 hours. Then they voted. OSI received the results of the Reach engagement in the tactical room aboard the OSI on day 9. She looked at the numbers of losses on both sides, assets destroyed, the 2 fleet stations, the position of Vron's withdrawn fleet. She looked at it for a long time. Dilo stood beside her and waited. They'll try to regroup at the secondary line, Osai said. They'll need 30 days to reconstitute enough to consider another offensive push. We have 30 days, Dilo said. We have less than that before the production curve gives us what I want for the next push. Osai straightened. What's the ground campaign status? General Park's forces have reclaimed 60% of the North Africa Theater territory. Central Asia is slower. The Vorath ground forces there have dug in significantly, but their supply situation is deteriorating, Osai said, because their supply lines run through space and we just hit the nearest logistics hub. Yes, ma'am. Osai nodded. She looked at the tactical display for another moment. Then she looked at the communication queue, 43 messages, priority flagged from UEF Council, member state governments, allied observers, one from her sister in Accra who had sent a 3-word message that said come home soon. She looked at that one for a moment. Then she moved it to a folder she would get to when she had time. Draft orders for the secondary push, she said, 40 days. Dilo wrote it down. And send Dr. Santos a production query, Osai said. I want to know what the fleet looks like at 60 days. She already knew, roughly. The curve didn't lie, but she wanted it in writing because there were days when even she needed to see the number written down to believe it. High Executor Vron stood before the Dominion High Council and gave his report in person. He was good at this. He was precise and clear, and he owned what needed to be owned without performing contrition, which the council respected. He had run campaigns for 30 years and given reports for 30 years, and he knew exactly what this room needed from him and how to give it. What he told them was accurate. What he did not tell them, because it was not the kind of thing that fit into a report, because he lacked the vocabulary for it, was what he had felt watching the Battle of Vorath Reach on his tactical display. He had watched 127 human ships fight. He had watched them lose 41 of those ships over 9 days. He had watched the remaining 86 continue pressing, reforming, adjusting, never once showing the behavioral indicators that the Dominion's models associated with imminent retreat or collapse. He had watched them celebrate between engagements on open channels that his monitoring team had intercepted. Bad jokes, the same pattern that had confused his analysts on the ground. The laughter, in Vorath understanding, meant something was funny. Funny meant light. Light meant the stakes were manageable. He had spent 9 days watching a species take catastrophic losses and laugh between rounds, and he had finally, on day 8, reached the conclusion that the laughter did not mean the stakes were manageable. The laughter meant the stakes didn't change anything. They were going to keep going. Win or lose the next engagement. Win or lose the one after that. They were going to keep going the way water keeps going, not because it's brave, but because that's what it does. The High Council voted to open formal peace negotiations. The message would take 11 days to reach Earth. Before it arrived, Osai's fleet hit the secondary line. The secondary line did not hold. Vron received the report in the room where he had given his council briefing. He sat alone with it for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and began composing the message he would send to the UEF, not through military channels this time, not the careful, formal diplomatic frequency. He addressed it directly to Admiral Osai. He wrote, "What would it take for you to stop?" He sent it. He waited. Her reply came in 6 hours. It said, "An end to the campaign. Your fleet behind your own borders. Negotiations on our terms at a location of our choosing. When you are ready to agree to those terms, contact this channel." It did not say, "You're losing and we both know it." It didn't need to. He read it 3 times. Then he forwarded it to the High Council, with one line of his own text attached. The line said, "I recommend we agree." The station had no name either. It sat at a gravitational midpoint between 2 unremarkable stars in a stretch of space that belonged to neither the Dominion nor the UEF. Technically, it belonged to a small trading collective called the Ven, who had built it 40 years ago as a commercial waypoint, and had been trying to sell it ever since, because it turned out that a gravitational midpoint between 2 unremarkable stars was not, commercially speaking, a desirable location. The UEF had leased it for 90 days. The Ven had accepted with a speed that suggested they understood a good offer when they heard one, and had not asked what it was for. The signing was scheduled for 10 a.m. station time. At 9:47, Admiral Yara Osai stood in the corridor outside the main conference room and read the terms one more time. Not because she didn't know them. She had been part of writing them, had spent 6 weeks in negotiations with 3 UEF Council liaisons and 2 Dominion representatives working through a translator who had to take a medical break twice because the stress of it was giving him headaches. She read them because she was the kind of person who read things one more time before they became permanent. The terms were not poetic. They were specific and measurable and enforceable, which was the only kind of terms worth writing. The Dominion would cease all military operations in human-occupied space immediately. Their fleet would withdraw behind their own border systems within 60 days, verified by UEF monitoring. They would pay reparations, a specific number, in specific resources, delivered on a specific schedule, to cover the cost of Auckland's reconstruction, the Meridian Station's replacement, and the 18 months of war damage across both ground theaters. They would accept UEF monitoring vessels in their outer systems for 200 years. 200 years. That had been the hardest part of the negotiation. The Dominion representatives had pushed back on it with everything they had. Osa had not moved. 200 years was not punishment. 200 years was a structure, a guarantee. A thing that meant that whatever came next, whatever government, whatever leadership, whatever shift in Dominion politics, the math was already done and the answer was already written. The Dominion signed because they were losing, and they knew they were losing, and they were intelligent enough to know that the losses would only compound. The Vorath did not make emotional decisions. They made calculations. The calculation had come back the same way 3 times, and finally the High Council had accepted what it said. Osai folded the terms document and put it in her jacket pocket and walked into the conference room. The room was not dramatic. That was the thing about it that people would remark on later when they tried to describe it. It was a medium-sized room with a long table and chairs, and a view through a single window of the 2 unremarkable stars and the darkness between them. There were 8 people on the UEF side and 6 on the Vorath side, and 1 translator and 2 assistants taking notes. No cameras, no press. The UEF Council had discussed whether to allow media and had decided against it, not because they wanted to hide anything, but because the kind of moment this was did not need an audience. The audience would come later. History would be the audience. Right now it just needed to happen. High Executor Vron was already seated when Osai entered. She had seen photographs of him, had seen intelligence footage. In person, he was larger than the footage suggested, and older looking, and his eyes were the specific flat color of someone who had been making hard decisions for a very long time and was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. She sat across from him. They looked at each other across the table. The translator introduced himself. Both sides confirmed they had received the final terms document. Both sides confirmed they had no outstanding objections to the text. The signing would proceed in order. Vorath first, then UEF, then the document would be registered with the Venn Collective as neutral witnesses, which was the legal requirement for interspecies treaties under the Galactic Commerce Framework. A document that had been written with trade disputes in mind and had never anticipated being used for this, but the Venn legal team had confirmed it applied. Vron picked up the instrument. He signed where his name was marked. He set the instrument down. He did not look at the document again. Osai picked it up, she signed, she set it down. The assistant on the UEF side made a note. The assistant on the Vorath side made a note. The translator said, in both languages, the terms are executed. It was 10:09 a.m. station time. The war had lasted 541 days. There was no applause. Nobody had arranged for applause, and in the specific quiet of those first few seconds after 10:09, nobody felt like it. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something very large stops. The silence is not empty. It has weight. It is made of everything that just ended. Vron looked at Osai. He looked at her the way you look at something you have been trying to understand for a long time and are still not sure you have. "What are you?" he asked. He said it in Vorath, and the translator hesitated for a moment before rendering it, perhaps uncertain whether the question was diplomatic. But it wasn't a diplomatic question. It was a genuine one. It was the question of a commander who had run 43 campaigns and encountered, on the 44th, something his models had not predicted and his experience had not prepared him for, and who needed not for strategy, not for the record, just for himself, to understand what it was he had been fighting. Osai was quiet for a moment. "We're the thing that didn't stop," she said. Vron looked at her for another moment. Then he stood, and his delegation stood, and they walked out of the conference room and through the corridor and back to their ship, and Osai watched them go. And then she was alone in the conference room with Diallo and 2 assistants, and the window full of unremarkable stars. Diallo said quietly, "That's it." "That's it," Osai said. They stood there for a moment. Then Osai picked up the signed document and put it in her briefcase and walked out. Keth Voss had not expected to be there. He had been invited as a courtesy. He understood that. He was a defector and a consultant and technically a person without a country, since the country he'd come from had just signed a peace treaty with the species he'd been helping for the last 18 months. His status was complicated. His paperwork was very complicated. 3 different UEF legal teams had been working on it for 2 months and had reached the conclusion that his situation was genuinely unprecedented and would require new categories. He had sat in the back of the room during the signing. Nobody had introduced him. He had signed no documents and made no statement. He had watched Vron sign and then watched Osai sign and then watched the room empty, and he had remained in his chair for about 10 minutes after everyone else had left. He was not sure what he felt. He was Vorath. He had spent 4 years studying humanity and then 18 months among them, and in all that time he had never quite stopped being Vorath, never stopped running projections, never stopped building models, never stopped analyzing. It was how his mind worked, and he did not think it would ever work differently. He had run the projections all those years ago. He had looked at the data and seen what the High Council could not see or would not see, and he had made a choice. He had come to Earth with what he knew, and Earth had put him in a basement, and he had waited. And then the thing he had projected had happened, and it had happened the way he'd expected, but bigger. Always bigger. That was the thing about humans he had consistently underestimated, even as he overestimated them relative to everyone else. The projections were always right in direction, and always short in magnitude. He got up, he walked to the window. The two stars sat there, unremarkable, equidistant, doing nothing in particular. He thought about Vron's question, "What are you?" He thought about Osai's answer. He thought about a parking garage in Accra, and a factory floor in Incheon, and a 3-container command post in the Sahara, and 41 names on a memorial that was still being constructed on the Meridian Station's replacement, which was nearly finished now. Crews working double shifts to get it done. He thought the answer was right. He also thought it was incomplete. They were the thing that didn't stop, but that wasn't the whole of it. The whole of it was harder to say. The whole of it was something about a species that had been in pain for its entire recorded history. Wars and famines and self-inflicted catastrophes stacked on each other like geological layers, and had never in all of that lost the ability to laugh. To build. To grieve in the morning and work in the afternoon and sit with each other in the evening and find, somehow, somewhere in all the weight of it, something worth continuing for. He did not have a word for that. The Voreth language did not have a word for that. He thought, not for the first time, that was the point. General Park went back to North Africa in the spring. It was not an official visit. He had not told anyone he was going. Not Osai, not the UEF Council, not the press office that had been asking for his time since the ceasefire. He had taken personal leave, which he had not taken in 18 months, and he had booked a commercial flight to Cairo, and then a smaller flight to the eastern edge of the Sahara, and then a car, because the roads were mostly repaired now, most of them, and the reconstruction teams had been working since the day the ceasefire was signed. He drove through what had been the theater. He recognized some of it. Some of it he didn't recognize, which could mean it had been rebuilt, or it could mean he had never seen it before because the war had moved faster than his maps could keep up with. He drove slowly. He was not in uniform. Nobody stopped him or saluted him or asked him anything. He stopped at a town that had been taken and retaken 4 times in 2 weeks. He got out of the car. He walked through the market, which was open. Produce and electronics and clothing and noise, regular market noise, the sound of people buying and selling and arguing about prices, which is one of the most ordinary sounds a human being can make, and which, standing in that specific street in that specific town, felt like something much more than ordinary. A monument was being built at the edge of the market square. He had read about it, a simple design, a wall of names 40 meters long, the names of everyone from this region who had died in the ground campaign. Not triumphant, not a statue of a soldier with a weapon raised, just names. The names in Arabic and English and French, all 3, because the dead spoke all 3 and the living wanted to be sure. He stood in front of it for a long time. The names ran in columns. He found after a while the section that covered the period when his command post was closest to this area. He read the names slowly. He did not know all of them. He knew some. The ones he knew he stayed with a little longer. A boy of maybe 8 or 9 ran past him, chasing something, a ball or a dog, too fast to tell, and shouted something back at a woman who was shouting something forward at him. And the whole brief exchange was loud and ordinary and alive, and Park watched it happen and felt something move in his chest that he did not try to name. He looked at the wall. Nobody came to take his photograph. Nobody knew who he was, or if they did, they left him alone, which was its own kind of courtesy. He was just a man standing in front of a wall of names in a market square in a town that had been rebuilt out of what had been left of it, under a sky that was clear and blue and completely, perfectly indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. He stood there until the light started to change. Then he walked back to the car and drove north toward the coast, where he had booked a room in a hotel that had been repaired since the campaign and was now taking reservations again, because the hotel was in the business of people coming and staying and leaving, and that business had resumed, and that was the whole point. The galaxy had been watching. Not visibly, not in any way that was officially acknowledged, but the Dominion was not the only spacefaring civilization in the region. And spacefaring civilizations have ways of knowing what is happening beyond their borders, and what had been happening for 541 days had been watched by no fewer than 12 separate civilizations who had each, in their own way, run their own projections. All of them had projected a Voreth victory. Some had projected a quick one. Some had projected a longer campaign, more costly for the Dominion than expected, but ultimately resolved in their favor. None of them, not one, with all their intelligence assets and projection models and accumulated experience, had projected this. The Dominion had gone in. The Dominion had been stopped. The Dominion had been pushed back. The Dominion had signed. The document was public now. The UEF had released the full text within 48 hours of signing, which was itself a message, the specific message of an entity that has nothing to hide about what it just did and wants everyone to read it carefully. 12 civilizations read it carefully. Several of them called emergency council sessions. Several of them quietly redirected certain planned diplomatic initiatives. A few of them recalled ambassadors for consultations. One of them, the Fen Collective, who had 3 trade stations near human space that they had been debating expanding, voted instead to expand significantly and immediately, on the reasoning that proximity to humanity was now a different kind of strategic asset than it had been 18 months ago. None of them contacted the UEF directly in those first weeks. They were still processing, still recalibrating, still trying to fit what had happened into frameworks that had not been built for it. Keth Voss wrote about this in the analysis paper he submitted to UEF Intelligence 6 weeks after the signing. He wrote about the recalibration happening in the neighboring civilizations and what it meant for human foreign policy going forward. He wrote about the strategic position Earth now occupied, not as a military power in the conventional sense, though it was that, but as an asterisk known quantity of a specific and previously unknown type. He wrote in the paper's conclusion, the galaxy did not know what humanity was before this war. They had categories: primitive, developing, pre-spacefaring, threat rated low. None of those categories fit now. They have seen what happens when you push this species. They have seen what it costs. That knowledge will shape every diplomatic contact, every territorial negotiation, every commercial agreement humanity enters into for generations. You did not just win a war. You wrote a piece of information into the galaxy's understanding of itself that cannot be unwritten. He paused there for a long time. Then he added one more sentence. I came here to warn you. You did not listen. I find to my considerable surprise that I am glad you didn't need to. The Meridian station came back online on a Tuesday. Not the same Tuesday. A different one, 579 days after the first. It was rebuilt to the same external dimensions as the original, the same corridors, the same observation deck, the same docking configuration, but everything inside was new, and there was one thing that had not been there before, which was a room just inside the main airlock, small, with no windows, with 41 names on the wall. The crew that moved in on the reopening day was 47 people from 14 countries. They carried their things through the airlock and passed the room, and most of them stopped at the doorway for a moment briefly before continuing to their quarters. The station's commanding officer was a young woman from Japan named Lieutenant Commander Keiko Watanabe, who was 26 years old and had joined the UEF 2 weeks after Auckland, and had spent the war in fleet logistics, and had put in for the Meridian posting 3 times before she got it. She was not famous. She was not decorated in any particular way. She was very good at running complex systems under pressure, which was what the Meridian needed, and she had wanted this specific job for reasons she had not fully explained in her application and did not fully explain now. She stood in the small room with the 41 names and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she went to the command deck and started running systems checks, because the station had been offline for 579 days and there was a great deal to do. Outside the window, the stars were the same as they had always been, indifferent, permanent, completely uninvested in what happened beneath them. The station hummed. The systems came online one by one. The crew settled in. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone was already making something that smelled like coffee, which was the most human possible response to being somewhere new. The Dominion had chosen to attack Earth. They had chosen it the way you choose something you are certain of, with confidence, with data, with the weight of 11 previous victories behind the decision. They had looked at a divided species on a single planet and seen something manageable, something that would bend, something that had been fighting itself for so long it surely had nothing left for anyone else. They had been wrong in a way that did not have a simple explanation. It was not that humanity was stronger than projected, though it was. It was not that the industrial capacity was greater than estimated, though it was. It was not that the military doctrine was more sophisticated, though it had turned out to be, not because it was elegant, but because it was various, the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of humans figuring out how to fight each other in every terrain, in every condition, with every possible disadvantage, and learning something from each one. It was all of those things. It was also something under all of those things that did not fit in a threat assessment model. The Vorath had looked at humanity's history of fighting itself and seen weakness, instability, a species that could not stop tearing itself apart. What they had missed, what the models had never captured, what 11 campaigns had never taught them to look for, was that a species which had been through everything humanity had been through and was still here, still building, still laughing at things that weren't funny, still putting names on walls and reopening stations, and making coffee in new kitchens at the edge of space. That species had already answered the question. The question every species eventually faces, in some form, in some moment. Is it worth continuing? Humanity had answered it. Not in a document, not in a speech, not in a philosophy. In the factory floors and the command posts and the market squares and the 47 people moving into a rebuilt station on a Tuesday. The answer was yes. It had always been yes. The galaxy now knew that. And somewhere in a Dominion command suite on the far side of the border, in a quiet room with a tactical display that was dark for the first time in 541 days, High Executor Vron sat with a cup of something warm and thought about a woman across a table who had looked at him without anger and said 4 words that explained everything and nothing simultaneously, and he ran the question through his mind one more time. The way you